Hey there, it's me, Professor Bernstein. In this video, you're going to learn some valuable, easy-to-use strategies for approaching readings and marking up texts. These strategies will help you cultivate a stronger understanding of the material you're reading, assist you in becoming a truly active and engaged reader, jumpstart your intellectual, your analytical, your creative juices, and get you started writing about what you're reading. We're going to start by turning our attention to 5 basic questions that will help you start becoming a more active reader. These questions appear on page 58 of Diana Hacker's book, A Writer's Reference. You should be writing down these 5 questions right now. I want you to write each question at the top of a separate sheet of paper because I'm going to just go over the questions themselves and then talk in greater depth about each one. And I want you to have room to continue taking notes. So here are the 5 questions. What kind of text are you reading? Is it a newspaper article, a speech, a letter, a poem, a short story, a scholarly article? 2. What is the author's purpose? Is it to inform, to persuade, to call to action? 3. Who is the audience? How does the author attempt to appeal to this audience? I'm just going to pause for a few moments so that you can finish writing down these questions. Question number 4. What is the author's thesis or theme? What question does the text attempt to answer? And 5. What evidence does the author provide to support the thesis or theme? These are just 5 very simple questions that you can ask to start that you can start to ask yourself whenever you're reading. Now I'm going to explain why these are important questions to ask yourself and how you can use them to start understanding, analyzing, and writing about a text. So let's look more closely at question number 1, which is, what kind of text are you reading? In general, it's just a really good idea to know what kind of text you're reading, and if possible, to think about the extent to which the text conforms to the traditional standards associated with this type of writing. Sometimes it's even more useful to think about what makes the text different from other works of the same genre, of the same category. For instance, if you're reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, you might benefit from asking yourself if his letter seems like other letters you've encountered. If so, in what ways is it similar to other letters you've read? If not, what makes it different? This is where you can get into the process of writing marginalia, that is, jotting down observations in the margins of your text. And this process of writing in the margins allows you to keep track of your thoughts as you're reading. Likewise, if you're reading a poem, say a poem like Pamela Spiro Wagner's How to Read a Poem, a beginner's manual, you can ask yourself if this poem is like other poems you've read. You can even ask yourself if there's something unusual about making a poem a manual. What is a manual? What do you usually expect from manuals? What strikes you about turning a poem into a manual? Are poems usually manuals? Why? Why not? Again, this is the point where you'd start jotting down observations in the margins of the poem. As you're starting to see, the simple question about a text genre can help you start thinking critically about what you're reading. I'm going to pause again to give you a few moments to finish writing up your notes. If you need more time, you can just press pause and resume the video when you're ready. Okay, now let's get into the second question. What is the author's purpose? Is it to inform, to persuade, to call to action? While reading, you can underline passages that indicate the author's main goal or goals and jot down your observations about the degree to which the author achieves this purpose. Here are some other questions you can ask yourself. Is the writer succeeding at informing, persuading, or calling you or his or her intended audience to action? Why? Why not? For example, if you're reading King's letter from Birmingham jail, you'll notice almost immediately that he is writing this letter to persuade the clergymen to change their mind about what they consider the protesters' unwise and untimely actions. It's up to you to figure out how he wants them to think about the protesters' actions, understand what strategies he uses to persuade his readers, and assess how well he seems to succeed in his purpose. When you're reading fiction, this question is a little trickier. If you're in my 102 class, we'll talk later on in the semester about why intention in fiction is a complicated issue when it comes to interpretation. For now, though, let's just think about how we can apply this question to Spiro Wagner's poem, How to Read a Poem. Her title is pretty illuminating. She is going to tell us how to read a poem. At least that's what her title tells us. She also is telling us that her poem is a manual. Now we need to think about what she tells us about how to read a poem and whether or not she persuades us that this is the best way to approach poetry. Again, I'm going to pause for just a moment to allow you to take some more notes. If you're watching this video, you can pause the video and finish taking notes. Now we need to think about the third question. Who is the audience? How does the author attempt to appeal to the audience? Sometimes you're not going to know the intended audience, and sometimes, especially with fiction, the intended audience is not all that important. Again, if you're in my 102 class, we'll talk about these issues later in the semester. Knowing the intended audience, though, is especially helpful when you want to start delving more deeply into an analysis of a text, especially a work of nonfiction. For instance, we know that King is directing his letter to the 8 Alabama clergymen who published a newspaper statement denouncing the actions in Birmingham. One way to take your reading of his letter to the next level is to think about how King addresses the members of his specific audience. How does he try to speak directly to them and their concerns? How does he present himself in relation to his audience? What makes his strategies effective or ineffective? What would it be like if he used different strategies of approaching them? These questions are also important to focus on when reading because they can help you think about strategies for persuading your own audiences, whether that's your professors, your employers, your potential clients, scholarship committees, or community organizations. Good writers aren't born, they're made, and we learn from each other. So you can pick up some underlying strategies from the readers that we're studying this semester. If you're reading Spiro Wagner's poem, think about who she thinks is in her audience. Are these people who are completely new to poetry? Are they individuals who have negative associations with the reading of poetry? What gives you these impressions? Do you think her style of communicating to these readers has the potential to open them up to the value and pleasure of poetry? Why not? Of course, you shouldn't just be letting these questions and thoughts flit through your mind. You should be underlining passages that relate to them and jotting down your observations in the margins. So now we're just going to go briefly over questions 4 and 5. Question 4 is, what is the author's thesis? If that's, you focus on thesis if it's a work of nonfiction, or theme if it's a work of fiction. What question does the text attempt to answer? In nonfiction, authors usually state their thesis, their main point, right away. So when reading nonfiction, you should mark what you consider to be the author's thesis. Writers of fiction, on the other hand, often avoid stating their themes right away, or even directly. So you have to be more of a detective. The best strategy is to mark passages that seem significant and jot down any initial observations or questions you might have about the thesis and/or theme. Question number 5. What evidence does the author provide to support the thesis or theme? If you're reading a work of nonfiction, you should pay attention to the writer's use of quotes from sources and other examples. Think about, does the writer rely mainly on one or two sources? If so, would the writer's thesis have been more compelling if she used more sources to support her claims? Or does the writer draw upon the insights of a wide range of sources? If so, to what extent does this strategy strengthen or weaken her argument? Are the sources trustworthy ones? That's another good question to think about, especially later on in the semester when you're doing your own research. If you're reading a work of fiction, you need to pay attention to details that point to the possible theme of the narrative. So you want to think about, how does the author use things like the setting, the tone, the characters, and plot to develop the theme? So now that we've gone over these important questions, I want to mention some specific strategies you can use to mark up your texts. Underlining and highlighting passages are perfectly good techniques, but there's a limit to them. If you just underline or highlight passages related to the writer's thesis, purpose, audience, and evidence, you're not going to be able to distinguish between these issues when you're reviewing your texts in order to write your papers or study for exams. So I suggest that you start experimenting with some other ways of marking up texts. As you'll see here on the screen, I'm listing some strategies or some techniques for marking up your text. One thing is to use different colors of ink to underline passages. So you might want to use red ink to underline passages that shed light on the type of sources and evidence that an author uses. You might want to make 2 straight lines in the margins to indicate the author's thesis, and 1 straight line to call attention to the supporting points. I like to use asterisks to indicate passages, like especially interesting passages, ones that I might want to use in an essay or discuss in class. I always recommend circling words that you don't know. Clearly, you're not always going to be able to look up every word that you don't know, but sometimes it's important, and if you just circle the words you don't know, you can go back later on and look up the ones you feel are essential for understanding the work. I also like to put boxes around powerful phrases or phrases that really stand out to me, sometimes because I want to make sure to use them in an essay, but also I like my eye when I'm going through a text to land on key phrases or things that I just find are expressed in a significant way. I also like to put question marks, obviously, next to things I don't understand, and of course it helps when you're reading a work of nonfiction to place an X next to things that strike you as problematic. So you've been given a lot of strategies in this video. Now you need to put them into action to use them. So from this point forward, I'm automatically going to expect you to mark up your text and write comments in the margins. This isn't something that I'm going to put on the syllabus because it's just something you should be doing whenever you're reading, unless of course you're reading a library book. So thanks for listening. I love comments, so feel free to leave some in the reply box. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to ask them. Bye.